Good evening.
Good evening, folks. Good to see you all.
Yes, that's true. Paul and I look a little bit lost because our speaker, Diane, has been here for the last 30 minutes. And just before we came to start, she's disappeared. Something happened to her connection. So we are looking at your faces thinking maybe she joined in under another name or something like that. So we still hope that she will come because we had a lovely Thursday prepared for you. But let's remain hopeful. And while we're waiting, as always, I will ask you to start typing and tell us a little bit about yourself. I know that Diane always asks me to send chat messages to her afterwards, and she reads them. And so apart from my usual questions about where you are in the world and what setting you are working in, whether you're in private practice, working for the NHS, working for other organizations, charities, and so on. I will also ask you this time to add a little bit more information about your experience of working with eating disorders, obesity, body image issues, whether you are specializing in this area, or whether you periodically see clients who come to you with these issues, or whether you're working with adolescents and these issues just crop up as you work with them. And another question I want to ask, whether you've ever trained with Diane. Because as you know, Diane is founder of National Center for Eating Disorders, and there she is. And she does a lot of training for all sorts of professionals working in the area of eating disorders and obesity. So I am just interested whether any of you have already trained with Diane in the past. And now I want to move to the courses which we will be discussing tonight. And these are 3 courses which will be delivered by Diane Jade, the founder of the National Center for Eating Disorders. And they will be delivered for us within the Working with Adolescents certificate. But I think I will be right to say that if you are working with these issues, even if you're working with adults, not with adolescents, please do consider coming to these three days. They are not full days, it's 2-hour courses, but they are 3 days in a row. So 2-hour one day, then second day, and then the third day. So it will be 6 hours altogether. And they will be on body image issues, on supporting young people with anorexia and bulimia, and the last day will be on obesity and healthy eating and the link to mental health. So these 3 courses, you can book them all together, and actually with a good discount as well. So please consider it and book quickly, because they are practically fully booked. That's how popular Diane is. So that's what I wanted to share with you. And I think Diane is here. Let me just unmute her, because, yeah, I've got 2 Dianes here.
You got 2.
Yes, well, there she is, and she's unmuted. Welcome, Diane, and I want to pass the microphone to Paul to introduce you formally and to ask you some questions. Guys, I want to just mention, we want to have as many questions from you as possible. So either put your electronic hand up if you have questions for Diane, or write them in the chat box. I will be monitoring it and will ask your questions if I have time for that. Okay, so start typing straight away. Paul, please.
Thanks very much, Julia, and welcome, folks. It's always a pleasure to have Deanne with us. Deanne is one of those people, if you've not worked with her before, who combines, and I hope she doesn't mind me saying this, an almost encyclopedic knowledge with an enthusiasm and a way of communicating complex ideas in a really, really accessible form. And I can't think actually of a single meeting that I've had with Deanne where I haven't come away with either a new perspective or a new insight, or, to be honest with you, because she appears to have her fingertips attached to the latest statistics and the latest data that's actually around, some immediate update in this particular field. So welcome very much, and glad to have you here, Deanne.
Thank you. I'm sorry that there are two of me. I had Zoom crash just when you started.
The more the merrier. The more the merrier. I just wanted to start off for people who are not necessarily that familiar with you, because I know that, you know, the National Centre for Eating Disorders and the work that you've done with that, setting up that organization and running it, has led you to be involved in a number of national forums, really, I guess, relating to eating issues, whether that's been with NICE and the development of guidelines, and whether it's been with the all-party parliamentary group for obesity, or whatever. You've had a lot of involvement. Can you just say a little bit for folks who are not familiar with the organization, when you set it up, and the sort of work that the organization does? Just as
I'll try and keep it brief. Thank you, Paul. When I started, and this was in 1983, I always remember my mother, bless her, saying to me, well, no one's ever going to come to an eating disorder organization because if they have a weight problem, they'll go to Weight Watchers. And then it was very niche. And as all of you will be aware, you cannot move now without seeing something about obesity in the paper, something about eating issues in the paper. We are overwhelmed with calls from schools, from parents, from people who are suffering. I think it's become among the biggest mental health topics in this century now. And it started just with me counseling, and then people came to me and said, will you teach me what you know, because there was no internet. Can you remember a time, anybody, where there was no internet, where there were no textbooks? You can. So it was very difficult to get good information, and I had to go to the big wheels, psychiatrists who were working with eating disorders, and say, teach me what you know. So it just evolved, and then it became a training organization, and everyone who trained now and passes an exam is given the opportunity to join our counseling network. And then it became international. So I sometimes go to bed at night and I say, my goodness, how did it ever get to be this big? And I didn't really have any pretensions for it to become big. My initial passion was just to help people who were suffering. I gave in the beginning an awful lot of my time free. We go to schools, I talk to parents. And so here we are now, and eating disorders and obesity, body image, self-image. As you know, if you work with adolescents and even with adults, it's absolutely huge. This is a subject that transcends genders, it transcends ages, but where eating disorders are concerned, it tends to start in adolescence. And so this is why I'm really passionate to help Paul and Julia with the material for the adolescent certificate.
I mean, that you raise so many issues there. Can I just focus on this one that you've mentioned, which is about the growth that has occurred for your organization, and also the growth in interest, and how that's actually changed over the years. I mean, as you say, there's never been so much interest in mental health and eating and body problems. And yet, rather than that increased awareness, in a sense, making the problem smaller, it feels like we've just got more and more problems in this area. I mean, why do you think that is when we have got more services now?
It's something I'm asked a lot, particularly by journalists, and journalists call pretty much every day saying, you know, why is it mental health such a big problem? I think it's something to do with the times we live in. I mean, many people here will be counselors. You'll all have your own experience of mental health issues among the communities you live in. And probably you've all asked yourself that question as well. Why are we so, we have so much information and yet we're so unhappy? Why is there so much unhappiness? I do remember reading a book, Paul, by a man, I can't remember his name, it was called Affluenza. Yeah. Affluenza was a book that suggested that the more we see people living ideal lives, we compare ourselves, the more we think we're lacking or wanting in something. It's very true for eating disorders. The more beautiful bodies we see out there, the more we think we should look like that, and we don't. And it's a really sad comment in the society we live in, that we've surrendered the old community people who we turn to, the parents who would be sources of wisdom, the elders of the tribe, the God, religion. You know, we dismiss it, and many counselors dismiss it. You know, it gave us a sense of grounding to feel that we were connected to something. Now we don't know what we're connected to. We don't know how to be. We see footballers earning hundreds of thousands of pounds. It creates its own unhappiness. I can only really put it down to that.
Yeah, so it's an interesting issue, isn't it? I mean, it does seem strange, as you say, that we live now in a society where we compare ourselves to other people so much more. We are bombarded with images of how we should be, and so on and so forth. I mean, this issue about eating problems and body image. I mean, maybe this is a daft question to ask, I don't know. Are there gender differences on this, or does it affect men and women in the same way?
Well, I'm sure you all know, we've got men here, we've got women here. There are definitely gender differences. And if we go right the way back through time, women have always been judged for their appearance. And men have been judged for what they do and what they can achieve. And women's fashions over the centuries have changed. I mean, some days, some things stick out more than others, and some things slide in more than others. You know, Chinese women used to bind their feet. They used to judge themselves by the sizes of their waist. Can you imagine the ideal waist size for a Chinese woman years ago was at 13 inches. It's almost impossible nowadays. But I've seen, and I'm sure you all know this, I've seen a shift very recently where men are becoming much more conscious of how they look. And they don't judge themselves by the same kind of values as women. You know, men don't aspire to be thin in the same way that women do. But they aspire to be fit and strong and muscled, but everybody has this kind of fear of fat. And I think for men, it became particularly bad with the Chippendales. And do you remember, anyone remember the Chippendales? These men who would go up on stage and show their bodies and whatever other parts of themselves they thought would get attention. And of course, social media's made it a million times worse for men and women. So what we've seen in the National Centre is all men coming forward, yeah. with eating
Right.
problems that we didn't even imagine would be happening to the scale it is, and boys dying because they're taking stuff that's supposed to burn off fat and they can get it on the internet.
So, I mean, I know that this is a big issue, big question rather for you, but, you know, obviously we're taking a CBT approach to this. One of the things that brings in center stage, obviously, is the beliefs that people actually have, which feed into these particular types of problem. Are there any particular themes that you've noticed in terms of people's beliefs that are central to the work that needs to be done, or is it just incredibly individualized? Is it impossible to identify particular themes for people?
Oh, that's a huge question, Paul. I am very much a fan of CBT, simply because one of the major drivers of either a weight problem or a body image problem or an eating problem is the beliefs that people have. And counselors often think it's all about feelings. And we talk about emotional eating and emotional starving and everything else. And that's also extremely valid. But the kind of beliefs that affect your relationship with food, for example, could be all the false assumptions that people bring to therapy, believing that fat makes you fat, or that you can only eat a certain number of calories a day, or that the best way to lose weight and keep it off is to go on some kind of bizarre eating plan. And you've asked a big question, because I could talk about the beliefs. Even body image is a set of beliefs we have about how we look and how we think other people see us and how we think we should look. So certainly when I train and talk to people or talk to clients, I'm as equally likely to say, what do you make of that? Or what thoughts come to mind? What beliefs do you have? Because the beliefs they have fast track to the emotions of shame and fear and anxiety and guilt that people carry into their relationship with food and their relationship to their body. So yes, it's a huge part of the work I do. If that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it does, but it, as ever, prompts more thoughts, really. I mean, you were saying at the beginning there about, for want of a better term, some strange, and I'm guessing that you would probably say inaccurate beliefs that people have about how to consume food, and basically myths in many ways about eating or dieting or whatever. How is it in an age where we have more access to better information about healthy eating? How is it that we have such, to be blunt with you, such weird, idiosyncratic beliefs that seem to take hold of people? Why is that?
Beliefs, I mean, if you're just talking about information, because there's many other aspects of beliefs, like how we think. Do we think black and white? Do we think catastrophically? You know, that's a side issue. But our beliefs and the meanings we have about food, they're forged in the crucible of our families and our peers, and what we're taught in school, and then what we hear on TV, and what we read in our grandparents. And we get all this information in our head. It's like information overload, isn't it, about food and eating? And we just filter it. And we create a set of rules that sometimes the filters that we apply are about our personalities, or about just what we happen to attend to and make real, because we were told this thing by someone we trusted.
Right.
And so the kind of meanings and beliefs and attitudes we have about food, they are very personal, Paul. And so when I work with one person, any one person, I will do a really good assessment. But I can also make a lot of assumptions about the beliefs they have. And I've, for example, an assumption I can make about someone with anorexia, for example, is the fact that they believe irrationally that if they were to start eating again, they would never stop. Or an irrational belief that if they ate a piece of toast, they'd gain 5 pounds, and they know that that can't possibly be true, but I know that it's emotionally true to them. And it's part of the delusion. So there's personal things, and there's also things that I can assume to be true about someone with an unhelpful relationship with food. I don't think we know what healthy eating is, by the way, going back to your other question.
Ah, right.
I don't think we know, partly because of this overload of information we've got, but also because no one can define anymore what normal eating is. I mean, if I were to ask everybody in the room here, how would you define normal eating? How would you define it? What would you come up with? I'd love to see it on the chat. Nobody knows because there's no normal anymore.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. It's almost like you're saying, well, a couple of things really. There's so much information that it's difficult to actually know what's valid, and that so many people have different opinions on this. And also the thing you mentioned at the beginning as well, which I always forget, which is that very often it's our relationship with the message giver that actually determines whether we believe something rather than whether it's actually accurate or not.
Oh, well, we see that in politics all the time, don't we?
Yeah, well, of course we do. We do very much so.
We accept it depends on who's delivering it. Actually, there's somebody called Kemi who asked a question on the chat. Kemi, I don't know whether you're a lady or a man or an in-between, but you mentioned mindless eating. That's a whole new story. And there's such a thing as over mindful eating. And that's something I will be talking about on one of the seminars that I'm doing for you, Paul, where you can go extreme on the healthy and you can go extreme on the mindful, and then you're also into problems. And how many people here in the room know about people who are over mindful and over obsessed with healthy eating, and that in itself is an eating disorder that we call orthorexia, and it's a very, very close cousin to anorexia. In fact, many of you may or may not know that we call orthorexia. Orthos comes from the Greek word correct eating. I have to eat in a way that's correct for me because I'm very concerned about my health. We call it an escape from anorexia. It's a very close cousin, and people with the orthorexia and anorexia share an awful lot of personality characteristics in common. It's another way of being anxious about food.
Gosh, it's almost like we've lost or any concept of what normal food consumption consists of.
Well, when I'm training, that's one of the first things that I tend to do with my adult counselor delegates. And I say, you can't define an eating disorder or disordered eating until you've first got your head around what normal eating is. And normal eating, it used to be quite easy because you could define it in terms of the culture and the people you lived with. But now, there was a woman called Faith Popcorn, and she said that the 21st century is going to be characterized by fragmentation, Paul. And that means that there's not going to be one way of doing things. There's going to be hundreds of different ways of being human in a particular society, whereas there used to be just one way of being Chinese in a Chinese society, or one way of being a peasant in a peasant society. Now there's hundreds of different ways of being a human being in our society. So we have to pick and choose. What's normal eating for one family is not normal for someone else. In fact, I would invite you to, just go to a cafe and watch people eating, and you'll find, oh, that's curious, and oh, I wouldn't eat like that. So we're all lost. Maybe that's why there's so much confusion now. Maybe that's why there's so many mental health problems, that no one knows what it is just to be moderate.
Well, that sort of raises another question that I wanted to ask you, really, which is this idea of misconceptions is presumably something that isn't just an issue for clients. I mean, you spend a lot of your time working with professionals. I'm just interested in your opinion. What would you say are some of the most common misperceptions or ways of going about helping people with an eating problem that I mean, I'm sure you wouldn't grab people by the lapels and shake them, but where there must be a part of you which says, my goodness, that's just not the, why aren't you doing X, or why aren't you doing Y, or don't you realize that? What are the most common mistakes, I guess, that professionals often make when dealing with eating problems?
Okay, I'm really afraid of saying this now, because in case I offend anybody. The biggest Pardon?
Go ahead.
Okay, all right. Okay, if anyone is offended, I apologize. The biggest problem that we find, right, is to assume that there's a basic psychology or a basic counseling or a basic psychotherapeutic training will fit the bill for working with eating disorders and obesity. These are powerful specialisms, and they also require understanding of physiology. That was the missing piece. Appetite, hunger, what makes the body gain weight, genetics, neuroscience. It's a massive field. It's a wonderful field as well, because when it can be understood, then you kind of know what to do with the person who's sitting in the room. You know much better what to do and how to help them. So the most common misconception is that there's one model, whether it's person-centered or even CBT or even psychodynamic, that can work to treat eating disorders. I think you need to know a lot. And again, I don't want to offend anybody, but the understanding CBT, Paul, understanding how people think, what food means, what the beliefs are. I often think the belief is parent to the emotion that is parent to the behavior. So a lot of counselors come out of a counseling training, a lot of psychotherapists come out of a psychotherapy training kind of frightened of CBT because they don't think it's you get close to the client, but I think you do. I think you get very, very close to the client when you can sit in the room and not need to say, how do you feel, but say, what are you thinking? What's going through your mind? Because then if they can access that, if they can, then you know how to help to change all the what we call stinking thinking that is keeping them stuck in their problems.
Okay.
Long answer to a short question, but
well, thank you. I mean, one final thing I just wanted to sort of close with, to be honest with you, is the this is a big problem, as you've rightly identified. If you ruled this country, we won't say the world, we'll just keep it limited to this country. If you actually ruled the UK and you had total power, and you could make one change in the laws of this country, which you feel would not solve the problem, but would make the biggest difference for the better in terms of addressing this particular problem, I'm not gonna hold you to it, can I say? I mean, if you if you get elected or lead a coup, I will allow you to have an open mind. But if, you know, what crosses your mind as being the thing that, in your opinion, would probably make the biggest difference?
Well, I gather everyone will have an opinion on that, but oh, I'd love to see more people trained in working with eating disorders and obesity, because I would ban the sale of scales. How about that?
That's, wow. That's an interesting start.
I would make them completely forbidden.
Right. Okay.
I would make it illegal for any adolescent to access the internet.
Right, we're on a
Until
roll
they're
now.
19. I don't know. I can see some of my colleagues say, "Oh, tax sugar," but I've never really gone down that route. I think it's always like plugging holes. It's like sticking your thumb in the proverbial, what do you call it?
Hole in the dike.
In the dike.
Yeah.
I had a senior moment there and I couldn't find the word dike, but I'm sure you know what I mean. I'd love to know what the rest of you thought, because wherever we look, and for prevention, I'll tell you what I would do, Paul. We know that the best defense against eating disorders specifically and body image problems starts very young in prevention. It's not going into schools and talking about anorexia and bulimia. I'll talk about that if you like when I do the modules. But we know that the best defense is helping children, very young children, before they get to that danger age of adolescence, an emotional vocabulary, a very wide emotional vocabulary. And we know this is some work done in the States, that's very protective against all kinds of self-harming, self-abusive behaviors, drugs, eating disorders, and so on. So I'd love to see it mandatory for that to be taught very, very young.
So I'll bear that in mind. So it's a scales ban, no internet for adolescents, and an emotional vocabulary curriculum.
A very wide emotional vocabulary curriculum.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll stop with the questions now. I'm sure we could go on with this for ages, but I know time is pressing on, and I'll hand things back to Julia, I'll hand things back to Julia now. And thanks very much, Diane.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Paul. I loved the questions, and I actually very happily would want to pass that last question, as Diane asked, to you. From your experience, guys, write in the chat, what would you do if you had a magic wand and could change one thing about eating, obesity, eating disorders? What would you suggest? That would be very, very interesting. I can see Akash wanted to ask a question. He had his hand up for quite a while. Can I just remind everyone, you are very welcome to ask questions in person. Just remind that it is recorded and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So in terms of disclosure, just remember that bit.
Julia, there are a lot of questions here. I don't know whether anyone is supposed to answer them or have them come back. And
what we'll do, while Akash is asking his question, I very quickly have a look at the questions and read them out, because they obviously go quickly up the chat. So Akash, go ahead please with your question and we'll have a look at the questions in the chat.
Hello, Diane. Really pleased to listen to your wisdom. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Akash, hello.
Perfect. Yeah. So regarding eating disorder, as you mentioned, that it starts from a very young age, and as Paul asked you many questions, what are the root causes and whatnot. In my experience, I've been around kids. I work at school as well, and there's a concept of instant gratification, because I study psychology and we have read papers regarding eating disorders, but I've never read a paper which talk about instant gratification in general, because the world has, when I say instant gratification, that everything is instantly there for, kids, so they go anywhere and there's instantly available, and they just take it and they gratify themselves. So this concept of instant gratification needs to be involved into the education system, I reckon, if I had a magic wand, because they need to understand the concept of food. They need to understand the concept of food as need, not a want. This concept of snacking all the time has, in my opinion, is a huge issue as well. There could be
you touched on some very, very big issues.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Yeah, because I've read papers about eating disorder, but I've never come across these points, and these points has always been in my head, and I've always these points in mind. For example, there have been debates about this as well. In general, parents have these questions that, for example, if you have fed your child, and you have fed a child enough food, you reckon a huge bowl or whatnot, and if your kid is asking for more food, what should be done? Do they really know if that's enough for them, or they just see something more interesting, something more colorful to be eaten or whatever, and they're just asking for it? You know what I mean?
You've touched on some huge things there. On the trainings that I do, we do talk about wants and needs, because that comes up in our relationship with food.
Because there has been this exaggerated sense of independence when it comes to kids, because I reckon that this exaggerated sense of independence should not be there, because when I remember me being a child, our mothers would feed us, but at the same time, they would, if we would ask for more and whatnot, I don't know, they would have a sense that, he should not be fed more or whatnot. So I'm from 90s, I was born in 95. During that age, it was very difficult to find a kid who had eating disorders or who would be obese and whatnot. But nowadays it's more easier because of this exaggerated sense of independence, where parents believe that, kids know what to do about their life, and they should do whatever they want in a sense. So I reckon there should be a firm hand a little bit there. So this independence should not be just because kids don't know the sense of responsibility. In my experience, independence and responsibility walk hand in hand, and kids do not understand the concept of responsibility. So in that sense, independence is exaggerated in this world at the moment. So there should be a firm hand involved.
Akash, let's give Diane a chance to answer, please.
Yes, except that it's not all bad news. There are young people who self-regulate and who have a good sense of responsibility and who aren't into instant gratification. What tends to mediate, the word mediate, that kind of life position, and their use of food and other substances is something quite deep, which is called self-esteem. If a person has high self-esteem, they tend to act in their own good interests. They do actually take care of themselves. You look around, you see a lot of kids growing up, they have ambition, they defer gratification, they're kind, people, they transition from being a child to a responsible adult in a predictable way. However, if their self-esteem is poor, they tend to either self-abuse, self-neglect, or over-control. Over-control is where you see the rigidity, the anorexic type behavior. That's over-responsible. That is not being grown up. It's being autonomous in a kind of harmful way, self-harmful way. So I hear what you're saying, and you're talking about wants and needs. That's also a big question, because what we need in terms of food, there's no little man walking around inside our body saying, you've eaten enough. This is something that I'll come on to when I talk about obesity and healthy eating. These systems are regulated homeostatically in the brain, depending upon what nutrients we get, but there's also a part of the brain, the opioid system, that is very, very wedded to pleasure. And at times it can override the homeostatic system. That's where I'm saying the physiology comes in. Fully understanding the physiology is very important. And someone basically mentioned the availability of food and it being all around us and it being on TV and it being in the media. We're being bombarded with these images all the time. It takes a very, very robust individual. You can walk past one McDonald's and one Costa Coffee and then 4 and 5 and the 5th one, you just give in. Because our emotions and our self-control is Paleolithic. It's still Paleolithic. We haven't yet caught up with how we cope with a very, very toxic environment. And that's another story. But maybe some of you here will have a view about that as well. Remember, the Paleolithic man hasn't caught up with the technological society in which we live. We watch television for 2 hours a night. You'll see 20,000, if you watch commercial TV, you'll see 20,000 food messages in a year. Mm. That's almost too much for a human brain, a Paleolithic brain, to cope with. Anyway, you've mentioned some very interesting points. And when we work with people with eating disorders, I mentioned the word moderation, how to help people be moderate is not making them be ultra healthy, and it's also not making them abuse themselves with food.
Thank you. It was a great answer, Diane. Let's just look at a couple of messages.
Good question.
Thank you. A couple of messages in the chat. Edison asks, how do you engage with adolescents who do not want to be in therapy? Let's just focus it on eating disorders, obviously not therapy generally.
Fantastic question. Fantastic questions and comments. I would say that 95% of adolescents with eating disorders don't want therapy. The reasons for that is, if you are to come to any of these lectures, that by the time it's established, the eating disorder behavior, the symptoms, which we call the various behaviors that constitute eating disorder, starving, reading diet books, blah, 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 running, exercising, those are called the symptoms, have become functional. By functional, I mean they've become useful in helping a person manage something that they can't manage in better ways. It could be family dynamics, it could be their own emotions. It's not necessarily to suppress emotions, it could be to block them, it could be anything. And they're also terrified. They're terrified of that somehow you'll make them get fat if they're restricting. They may have other benefits, that they're admired for their self-control. There's thousands of things for which the eating disorder has become useful. And there's also a certain amount of shame. If someone is bulimic, which is the overeating disorders and the purging, there's an awful lot of shame. And also they're using the eating disorder as an emotional regulator. That's part of assessment, is to tease out from someone exactly what the eating disorder is doing for them before we sit there and say, I'm going to fix you. That would be the worst possible thing to do. I'm going to take away your eating disorder. It's the only crutch they know for coping with what is a very messy and difficult time in their lives. So you know better than I do what the challenges of adolescence are. And would anyone here like to go back to being a teenager? I don't think I would. We have to swim through it and come out at the other end part, you know, as a fully functional human being. The challenges are intense. So how do you deal with someone who doesn't want to be in therapy? I have several techniques which I use, one of which is to use what we call hip pocket patient thinking, to say, tell me, do you want to be here? No? Okay, well, tell me about why you would come. Oh, well, it's to make your parents happy. I'll say, well, okay, if I think there's nothing wrong with you, and then I'll tell your parents. Is that fine? You know, I'll just meet them at their level, and I'll assess them not with a pen and paper and taking lots of notes. I have a way of assessing them which engages them fully and actually excites their curiosity. But again, I can't describe that on this particular session. I want to make their experience of the first therapy they might have ever had as being as rich and as marvelous an experience as possible, so that they lose their fear of being in therapy. And I don't tell them, I don't judge them, I don't tell them that they're doing a terrible thing and I can make them better. I'll often say, well, okay, what's this doing for you? Let's find out together what this eating disorder, what this eating issue is doing for you. What's good about this for you? They're quite shocked because they think I'm going to tell them they're bad and wrong and sick, and I don't. I sometimes say, well, if that had happened to me, I would want to be starving as well. It makes perfect sense to me. The first thing to do with a very reluctant, defensive adolescent is to find a way of engaging with them. So when I train, we do an awful lot of work on engagement at the beginning of the training, and they're getting them curious. So often the first question I'll say is, okay, here I am, here you are, you got here. What do you want to know about me? What? Ask me a question. I'm not going to start firing questions at you. And then if they don't want to, and they're usually sitting like that, normally I spend a lot of time in saying, okay, would you like to know about whether I have an eating disorder or not? Would you like to have a look in my fridge? Whatever it is that gets them curious enough to sit and just open up. And then I get them to tell me a story of their life in pictures and to draw it with me. That's something I've let out. And that they find very engaging. So there's no secrets. I don't write things down on a paper that they can't see. Everything is shared with them. I also don't label their eating disorder, whether it's anorexia or bulimia or binge eating, something that hasn't been mentioned, but it's a very, very, very significant eating disorder in the life of adolescents, especially dieting adolescents. Then I don't give it a name. I don't say you're anorexic or you're bulimic. I say if there was a movie of what you're doing and I name what they're doing and you were the star of that movie, what would that movie be called? This is called a reframe of the eating disorder. And then we might kind of work together in figuring out in what ways it's like anorexia or like bulimia. I also know that people with anorexia hear a voice, and I don't know whether you are aware, any of the people here in this meeting, that people with anorexia hear a voice. How many of you knew that? Okay. And then I won't say, do you hear a voice? I'll simply say, what does the voice sound like and where is it? You know, it's a little bit about getting that curiosity in. And I would say in 95% of cases, a very reluctant adolescent is still glued to the sofa by the end of the first counseling hour. And that's great. That's all I want. So that they're not scared to come back.
That's very, very enlightening and wise, Diane, and thank you very much. We've got quite a lot of questions which are specific, some for anorexia, some for obesity. I can only say we are approaching 8 o'clock. That's definitely our cutoff point, and I just welcome you to come to Diane's courses. You don't have to book all 3. You can book them one by one if you're only interested in obesity or anorexia or body image. So that's entirely up to you. And another question about how to connect with Diane. Diane is a founder of National Center for Eating Disorders. Go on National Center for Eating Disorders website and you will be able to connect with Diane. So that's the way to do that. But I really hope that you will come and work with us in March on these 3 days, because I think we don't need to prove. Diane has plenty more to say, because it's definitely will be worth your while. So thank you very much, Paul, for your interesting questions, Diane, for your fabulous answers. I put all the links for you in the chat, and hope to see you soon. As always, now you can unmute yourself and say your goodbyes, and we'll see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Good evening. Thank you, dear. Thank you,
Thank you,
Jane.
Tammy.
Paul.
Great
Very
question.
much.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Good night.